Hello, everybody. Nicholas Snow here, and I am your promo homo. So excited that you're here today. And on the show, I have someone I have known for decades. I know him for decades as a friend, Dennis, but he's Dr. Dennis Sapire, PhD. I'm going to tell you all about him and bring him to this show. It's a Hopeful Sexual special report. And this is the first of these special reports, but I hope there are many. And the whole purpose is to inspire authentic human connection. That's what we are all about, and I'm grateful that you're here. I want to give you a little bit more about the campaign and its genesis, and then the rest of the time, we're going to be speaking with our expert guest, Dr. Sapire.
Like a diamond, you alone. You cut my heart like glass, just like that. Like a lion, uncontrolled. Your mark is on my back, just like that. In it for the big thrill. Yeah, you play games with my mind, always, all of the time. In it for the big win. Yeah, you own all of my mind, always, all of the time, all the time. Collide with me, come high with me, and I go for you. Divine and free, so ride with me. Yeah, we'll go. Like a fire and lose control. We like to burn out fast. We're hot like that. Like a diamond, you alone. You cut my heart like that, just like that. Yeah, in it for the big thrill. Yeah, you play games with my mind, always, all of the time. In it for the big win. Yeah, you own all of my mind, always, all of the time, all the time. Collide.
So the show is about sex, which means I know you're tuning in. And today I'm just honored to welcome Dr. Dennis Sapire. He is a sought after clinical health psychologist and clinical sexologist with a PhD from the California School of Professional Psychology at Alliant International University. Dr. Sapire studied sexology at the Institute for Advanced Study of Human Sexuality in San Francisco and is a fellow of American College of Sexologists. He is trained in biofeedback, neurofeedback, sex therapy, and EMDR. He has presented and lectured on various aspects of sexology and health psychology and has been a consultant in relation to chemical dependency as well as psychosexual recovery, dating, and relationships for patients facing significant medical challenges. And he has also been, well, he is right now, he has a thriving practice based in the Coachella Valley area, I think Rancho Mirage specifically. So without further delay, let me welcome to the show Dr. Dennis Sapire. Hi, Dennis. Hi, Dr. Sapire.
Hi, Nicholas. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. And before we move any further, congratulations on your documentary.
Oh, thank you so much. It was a big hit yesterday, and I'm just very moved, but I appreciate that.
Yeah,
Dr.
fantastic.
Sapire is referring to a documentary that I produced, and it's called Tinseltown's Queer 30 Years Later, and it looks at the 1990s public access show that I produced in the Los Angeles area. I think that's about the time you and I met, Dr. Sapire.
I'm not sure. I remember Tinseltown Queer and
That was
later notes from Bangkok, notes from Hollywood.
I've done all kinds of things, but I remember having dinner with you at a restaurant on Melrose during a Pride weekend, and that would have been in the 1990s. There were
I'm,
a group of us.
I guess so. I guess so.
Yes.
I'm grateful for your memory.
Well, thank you. I don't remember a lot of things, but you are memorable.
Uh-huh.
So, as I explained to you when I invited you onto the show, that I just realized that one of the challenges I personally might have meeting people is I've been taught all my life that my sexuality is not okay. And of course, I've done lots of work, as have many, to overcome that, embrace and own and celebrate our sexuality. And I think it's an issue not just for members of the LGBTQ plus community, but people from all walks of life to own, celebrate, express, and share their sexuality. And so that's the premise of this whole theme of topics. But in reaching out to you, I know you really would like to talk about secrets and intimacies and dating and relationships and how they all combine. So, what inspired you to want to talk about that particular mix of elements today?
Um, but let me firstly just go back to a point that you've made, and then I'll answer your question. I use the premise of the equivalence of arousal in my work, and I'll give you an example from the straight community. For instance, if a man says to me that he's aroused by large breasts and another man says he's aroused by flat-chested women, is one better than the other? I think not. I think it's an absurdity to suggest that one should be like the other. And I think that this applies across the panoply of sexual arousal. We ultimately need to decide, not need to decide, our bodies decide what we want. Our bodies tell us what we want, and we are most fulfilled if we pursue what our bodies dictate. Back to your question.
Well, before you get into that, do you believe that what one's body tells them they like is related to their choice or related to their nature? And is their nature taught and learned or
Oh,
inherited?
absolutely not related to their choice. I wish it was so. Good grief. And once again, I'll use the parallel in parallel straight and gay community. When someone says, I've lost interest in the person I love, oh, they wish that they could just decide as a matter of choice to be aroused. But it isn't just a matter of choice. Something happens that's part of our nature. So it's not just the nature of orientation, but the nature of all arousal within the larger groups of orientation, if you know what I mean. Because as we mature, so hopefully we get to realize that more precisely what it is that we want. And it happens almost without fail. Some people can't face it, and others do. And those that face and seek that which their bodies determine are generally, that's how you're sexually fulfilled.
Okay, so there's every human being has their inherent sexual nature and who they are attracted to. But then once they know that and once they want to pursue it, then we get into the world of secrets and intimacies and dating and relationships.
Well, right. If I can just divert to the world of intimacies, as I call it, and I loved your introduction about Hopefulsexual because you spoke about connections. Intimacy is really connectedness. And there are many types of intimacy. So as we meet someone and we start deciding that we're going to date them, I suggest that we go through certain stages. I'm not suggesting, I'm saying it happens. Physical intimacy, not sexual intimacy, is what I refer to when we bring our physical connectedness closer, greater proximity. We sit in a car together, we sit at a table together, we sit at seats together at the movies. We're bringing ourselves together to have more physical connectedness in order to see whether this thing will go anywhere. A very important aspect of connectedness arises early on, and I call that values intimacy, another type of intimacy. We need to have similar values in certain regards. These days, we know that political values, terribly important, And the United States is very divided. So that if you turned up for your meeting with someone first time at a restaurant, and within a few minutes you realized that the other person's a Bernie supporter, and for argument's sake you're a Trump supporter, chances are that the values difference is going to be so great that that's not good. That isn't going anywhere. But there are many other types of values. If, for instance, your plan was to meet at 7 p.m. at Lulu's or wherever, and there you were at 5 to 7 because that's your nature, and your partner arrives at 7:30, and you're kind of waiting for the apology as this person walks in. There's no apology. And the person said, "Well, I'm here, aren't I? What's your problem?" Well, you say, "I hadn't planned to eat 3 loaves of bread while waiting for a meal with you." And you better realize pretty quickly that there's a values difference, and that values difference is about being on time. And likewise, there are tons of values that we have in the way we live, and hopefully people use the dating period not just to achieve whatever base they're looking for or to have sex as soon as possible, but also to realize whether there are any amber or possibly red flags that are not likely to change through the relationship, no matter how many years you're together.
You know, the scenarios that you're talking about, and your points are very well made. They're assuming that the participants embrace their sexuality, they feel comfortable pursuing these connections, and they actually create dates for themselves. But for the LGBTQ plus community, there are a lot of people who have had huge challenges even giving themselves the permission and creating a world in which there is the freedom for them to even have that date at Lulu. So there's a whole plethora of growth and acceptance and massive journeys for members of the LGBTQ plus community to even show up at the date. Because in the heterosexual community, they grow up in a world that celebrates them and has been created to foster their connection and their relationships.
Yes, your point is well taken. As it turns out, my skew possibly is my practice involves mostly out gay men and probably as many heterosexuals. I don't get to see that element of suffering that you're describing, the result of social oppression, which some of us lived through and still are aware of. So what you say is serious. Some people can't even get there. And what it does, unfortunately, when we are potentially shamed about our orientation, is the body's emotional warning system kicks in. That emotional warning system we call anxiety. Anxiety covers worry, fear, dread, panic, concern, all of those words. And it's always future focused. So if you're worried about a negative consequence, and of course there are negative consequences, people are thrown out of homes, they're thrown out of jobs, there are all sorts of scornful consequences that people potentially face as a result of coming out. And it's that secret that I was alluding to in setting up the topic for today, wanting to say not just that coming out as a gay person is a secret that can be shaming, but also there are lots of others. I work with a lot of people, rarely actually about the coming out process as a gay person, much more about the coming out process as a trans person, or with people whose coming out involves, when do I disclose that I'm an alcoholic? When do I disclose that I am that I have a sexually transmitted infection? When do I disclose these things? These are all closets, and the type of secret that for me is a closet is a secret that is potentially embarrassing and shaming and could lead to rejection.
I put your website on the screen for our viewers to be able to find out more about you, and it's easy to remember. DS for Dennis Sapire, PhD for Doctor, dsphd.com. Um, you mentioned you work with a lot of out gay men, and dating and relationships are part of your theme for today. And I was wondering if you would talk about the experience, strength, and hope that your patients discover that allows them to have better success in dating and relationships.
Um, I'm trying to think of examples because when you spoke of out gay men, um, a lot of people who are out, especially older gay men, struggle to find the full connectedness in a relationship that they'd want. And I'm thrilled when I'm with someone, and sometimes have been for some time, when at the age of 70, they finally find their true love. It's important to me to mention that because that's what Hopefulsexual is about. I'm not, because of where I am in Rancho Mirage, average age 75, I'm guessing, I don't really know, dealing with as many young people. But of course, I also see a lot of people from Palm Springs, average age 65, probably, I'm guessing, and not
So
me.
far, barely I'm under your average ages. So far.
Really. Well, what it does for me is reminding people when they come in and say, I'm 60, I can't, too late to do anything. And I quote my 80-year-olds to them who say, oh, I wish I was 60. Oh, I could conquer the world at 60.
Well, I'm 62, so I'm still on that hopeful side, as demonstrated by my shirt. Yes,
Yes.
lots of hope. Um, I know that, first of all, I really value your time and energy and your willingness to be on the show today. So I could come up with all kinds of questions, but I want to make sure that we really do address the key points that you want to make today. And then with time, I might have some other questions. But what is it that you would really like to share today about your work, about the topic, and about the people you serve?
Well, I'd actually like to share the way that people misread anxiety. Let's deal with that today because I want to, in a certain sense, celebrate anxiety. My message about anxiety is that our bodies have fundamentally two warning systems. The one is physical and the other one is emotional. The physical warning system we call pain. I'll give you an example of why we need it. Imagine I had that illness that if I were looking over there and had my hand on a stove here, I could burn off my hand and not know that I was doing that because of a particular illness that I had. That illness is called leprosy, anesthetic leprosy. And what is the lesson from that illness? We want to be able to feel pain. We don't want to feel pain, but we want to be able to feel it. Likewise, for parallel track, anxiety is our emotional warning system. We need anxiety to live. Anxiety tells us when we're at risk. Accordingly, at the very smallest level, and you might not even be aware of it, when you cross the road, you experience anxiety. That's why you look left or right. It's not actually because your grandmother told you, and we know it's not that because if we give you enough alcohol or benzodiazepines, you'll just walk. So it is your sense of danger, and that sense of danger is so important. Unfortunately, we're primed as gay men as a result of the shame that is imposed, the social oppression, gay men, LGBTQ. I mean, I'm not saying that trans folk don't face it because, wow.
They certainly do. We know that, yeah.
Absolutely. But we're primed to be hypersensitized because there have been real risks of scorn, of bullying, and of loss of jobs. Consequences used to be thrown out of the military in earlier times, getting green-lined in the civil service and thrown out. So, and then there's family and other social oppression. As a result, we're primed. We're primed to recognize risk very, very quickly, very, very easily, very, very sensitively. And what happens when we perceive risk, we experience anxiety, which covers concern, fear, dread, panic, worry, these sorts of words, what anxiety is made up of. And it is foresight that we have. Anxiety focuses on the future and tells us we are at risk. Now, what do? Sometimes it stops us from doing what we want to do. And in this particular case, from being who we want to be, because we become overwhelmed and fearful of what we face. Anxiety leads to the condition we know as fight or flight, which medical practitioners know as sympathetic nervous system arousal. And the way that it happens is when you perceive danger, your hypothalamus, which actually, according to science, seems to have a lot to do with sexual orientation, in this case, signals the body to put out adrenaline, and that causes a cascade of effects through the body, preparing us for fight or flight, which includes a bunch of other Fs, the most common being freeze. The way people react mostly in modern society to the impulse we call fight or flight is actually to freeze. The deer in the headlamps. It stops us from coming out. It stops us from asking someone we like if they like us as well. By way of, will you have a cup of coffee with me or something like that? We freeze. And so realizing the role of anxiety in this, and that society has set us up to be hypersensitive and to possibly overreact, we don't get as easy a chance as mainstream community to find our happiness in connectedness and relationships.
Would you describe it as bravery to identify and move through anxiety to make connections? How do you coach people to identify this anxiety that allows them to then perhaps have that coffee date?
In cognitive behavioral therapy, which I do apply to some degree, there's the concept of prolonged exposure or exposure therapy. We do get better by getting used to it. And so the aim is to build a ladder of degrees, not to throw people in at the deep end, which is terrifying, but to allow them to develop a hierarchy and to work their way up the hierarchy, getting used to coping with a certain amount of stress. Yes, it takes courage. However, we can minimize the courage component. Systematic.
I had a recent, I really appreciate talk therapy. I have seen mental health counselors more often than not throughout my life. I've valued it greatly, and I I was dealing with anxiety in a way that was preventing me from being productive the way that I wanted to be. And I always thought that my anxiety was because of the circumstances of my life and not necessarily because of some sort of chemical thing going on in my body. And I recently, for a period of time, was on a 10 milligrams of Lexapro and then successfully titrated off of that over time under the care of my physician. And now experiencing a time in my life where I'm not seeing a therapist, I'm not on a medication, I'm very blissful, serene, productive, I'm not experiencing anxiety. I'm really having one of the best times of my own life regarding joy, happiness, and it's definitely a journey. I know you're not a psychiatrist, you are a psychologist, but I was wondering when you're working with people, how do you help them or how do you know whether or not they need to be referred for medication versus behavior modification?
Okay, well, great point you raise. Firstly, if I can just clarify, when we talk of talk therapy, the idea is that we do nothing other than talk.
Oh, I didn't mean
My
to
practice.
minimize. I didn't mean to minimize
Oh
the.
no, yeah. My suggestion is not that you're minimizing, because that's the appropriate term. Um, for me, practice is a therapy of action. We change our world by the actions that we take. And ironically, sometimes medication can keep us frozen. So, for instance, if I give you the worst example of someone who wants medication, um, my partner's beating me, please give me medication so that I can live with him. That would be absolutely ridiculous. Action is needed. The aim of medication is not to stabilize a situation in which your being is screaming out to you, something needs to be changed, and we give you enough benzodiazepines so that you're okay staying like this. That's not the goal. Lexapro and Paxil of the SSRIs, which are antidepressants, happen to also be labeled for anxiety. And I think that was probably just a good move by the manufacturers, in that they, for the phase 3 trials that are FDA trials for approval, they probably looked at not only symptoms of depression, but also showed that when depression improves, anxiety improves. So just to kind of rule them out, it's almost quirky to take them for anxiety. They're not really, they weren't designed to be anxiolytics, and often they take 6 weeks before they kick in, whereas the true anxiolytics, the minor tranquilizers or the major tranquilizers, work within minutes. So Lexapro was given to you presumably for depression, maybe for anxiety as well. It's wonderful that you're doing well without them. I am, of course, fully aware of the fact that medication, I don't have a prescribing license. I work as a psychologist. A number of psychiatrists have and are my patients. We work in a different realm, not using medication. I try to help people to find actions that they can take that can change their world, change their being.
You've been taking a lot of action in your life for decades to change people's lives, and I just commend you for that. I'd like to get into just a little personal information about you. What inspired you to walk this professional path?
Ah, um, uh, let's see, where should I start? You may or may not know that I practiced law for 30 years, and
I
that
remember that now that you mention it, I do remember that.
I'm licensed to practice in 3 countries.
South Africa being one of them.
Yes, Lesotho, and let's call California a country for these purposes. I am retired from law. My license is inactive, so I do not make claim to be an attorney, nor do I offer legal advice. I made a change of life many years ago, pre-internet. I set up a dating bulletin board system before the internet using the computer telephone interface that could be dialed into. And I learned about this from a wonderful marriage family therapist in Los Angeles who helped me get into the practice. And I found that I was learning about the world and about human behavior in a way that I hadn't known of before. As a result, I decided, because the business was going pretty well, that I'd like to study psychology and human sexuality. And so I went back to UCLA. I did 44 units or so, enough to take the GRE in psychology, took the GRE, and got into a doctoral program. Because I wanted to do sexology as well, because a lot of my work involved dating and helping people find either sex or relationships or whatever else they wanted to do on the bulletin boards. I wanted to study sex, and it wasn't available at my school at a high level. Unfortunately, most psychologists are not offered much training in sex. In order to get licensed in California, and possibly this is nationwide, we had to do 8 hours in human sexuality, which is really nothing. You can barely, as it were, touch on anatomy during 8 hours. So I found an independent accredited school in San Francisco and studied human sexuality. And as a result of my fascination and the resources I have built up one of the better private collections of writings on human sexuality of the last 150 years. I've got the works of the German sexologists who fled from Hitler. I've got the works of church folk, not really published by the church, although I did see the Mormon bishop's encyclical on homosexuality, which is generally 100 years out of date. And I have the books to prove it. And I started accumulating books looking for, in many cases, writings with the authority of either church leaders or doctors, MDs, which added to the oppression of homosexual behaviors. For instance, I have a book that went to, I think, 44 editions by a doctor called Mehta, same name as the conductor of the LA Philharmonic, MEHTA, which states that the male homosexual menstruates. And so, yep, I wonder who did that research.
Yes.
Yes. So I actually put together a talk that I've given.
If that's true, I have to tell you my period is very, very late.
It's
very late. It's never shown up.
Well, it would speak to your pregnancy, but really.
Of course. I keep trying. I'm not pregnant yet.
Right. I give a talk on diagnostic criteria for homosexuality over the last 100 years, which includes things like what is, well, I must explain how this arose. If people could afford a physician 100 years ago, and men, for instance, being the power players in society, didn't want to be like that, homosexual or queer or whatever the negative term of the time was, they'd go to their doctor, and their doctor would have a list of diagnostic criteria which they could put to them, such as, what's your favorite color? To you, Nicholas, what's your favorite color?
It's always been green.
Oh, no. And you know that that's the biggie.
I did not know. So what are you about to tell me about my favorite color being green?
Well, that is a diagnostic criterion for homosexuality. It might be why J. Edgar Hoover had people use a green underlining pen to designate the names of homosexuals for purposes of throwing them out of the civil service.
Well, in that case, I have to say I'm very proud that my favorite color is green.
Well, I suspect that it comes from the in the 1920s. It doesn't come from that, because I've got a book going back to the turn of the previous century, which speaks of green as being the homosexual's favorite color. And that was by a fellow called Havelock Ellis, who was the great British author in sexology of the time. But I believe that on Tuesdays and Thursdays, or just Thursdays in New York City in the 20s, a man could identify himself as wanting other men by wearing a green handkerchief. And so it was probably the start of handkerchief colors. This green would be identifiable. And maybe that came from Havelock Ellis, but that's as far back as I can go, about 120 years back. Other criteria were, for instance, that the male homosexual's head rests lightly on his shoulders. Mr. Bobblehead, it's sort of, the swishy kind of thing. There's a lot of the criteria related to being more like a woman than a real man. So, for instance, the male homosexual's musculature was smaller than that of a heterosexual.
Was this what was
This
were
is
these
before
theory
gyms were readily available.
these were theories?
Oh, this is outrageous. Oh,
Right. This is yes.
this is all part of the oppression
Right.
because,
Exactly.
and it was very useful for powerful men because if they were concerned about themselves, they could go to a doctor. The doctor would run down these 10, 20, 30 things that were known and obviously conclude, oh no, it's just an anomaly. You're not one of them. So it had a social purpose for powerful, affluent people. And I gave a course of lectures on anomalies of sexuality in which something like that, the powerful men and their sexuality gave rise to people that were called witches. Witches were, of course, just women. But imagine the scenario in the 14th century, 15th century of a wealthy man finds a young wench very attractive, has sex with her, and this is discovered. Well, it couldn't possibly be the man's fault. This had to be the devil that done it. So she had to be a representative of the devil. Hollywood has long shown witches as ugly, warts and big noses and scraggly gray hair and out of shape. But I've got art from the 14th, 15th century in books. Paintings of witches always showed beautiful women. They were never ugly. This is a new thing that Hollywood developed. And these witches, if they did end up ugly, it would have been because they were sent out of the village as a possible punishment and had to live under trees or in hollowed out bark or something. And you do that for 20 or 30 years and you're going to look, a bit of a mess. But the theory in which witchcraft was about was interfering with the laws of God. And because Europe had two systems of law, ecclesiastical law and civil law, ecclesiastical being like Sharia, which was run by the Catholic Church mostly, under ecclesiastical law, there was this pursuit of the devil's emissaries, and any person that participated in having another person sin or break their holy vows of marriage obviously had to be wrong and the devil who did it, not the usually older, more powerful man who took advantage of this often girl.
Wow. Well, our conversation took a pathway I had not imagined, but what I've learned is that we could talk for hours and hours, but I know you are on your day off and that you work very hard. And I can also see it would be great to have you back in the future because you're an endless resource. I'm putting your website on again. In the final few minutes, you can take as long as you want. What would you like to say in conclusion for this particular broadcast?
Well, let's conclude with a few items of different types of connectedness that people can have within relationships. Sexual intimacy, which is what people usually mean by intimacy, it's kind of, they were intimate, it's a euphemism for having sex, is invariably one that is pretty set in stone. You find someone attractive or you don't. I don't go with the idea that we can take a person you don't find attractive, throw some rose petals around, and suddenly you have an erection. Really.
We'll pray over you.
Yeah, something like that. I give the example to people often of the genuineness of arousal in saying, who would you rather be with? Someone who is wonderful, hot, and sexy at a Motel 6 or a frump at the Ritz?
Let's go to the Motel 6.
Everyone goes to the Motel 6. Who wants the frump? because it does
You
something
can
to
you
us.
can learn that by going on any of the gay male apps, you know.
Oh, they all meet
There's
at the Motel
there are
6. I
lots of
didn't
people
know.
there at the Motel 6, but then you want to be careful that they're not partying and playing. There's all sorts of vetting you need to do in that environment. I'm
Well,
sure,
yeah.
yes.
Um,
But
and so,
I get it. I get it. And you know, it's like I've tried to date people because they're wonderful human beings. Like for
mhm,
example, I'm a proud and total bottom, and I
mhm.
don't mind that the world knows about it. And so I've tried to date people that I wasn't really sexually compatible with because there were so many things I liked about them. But I've come to a place where if I don't have a powerful sexual chemistry with somebody, I just want us to be friends. I don't want to be in a relationship that doesn't that maybe I
Well,
would make a different choice in the future, but at this point in my life, I would rather be single and have wonderful friends than to be in a primary relationship that doesn't have a hot sexual component.
well, I must comment about that because I do work with people who try to invent different types of relationship, and I also work with many people in long-term relationships where sexual interest died years ago, but they've stayed together because they love each other. So I'm not here sitting saying that that is the only type of
Oh, sure.
relationship. If you know what I mean, it's
Sure.
each person's decision. Um,
Definitely.
what do you want? It's very difficult to start dating on the basis that I want to live with you because I want to go to the movies with you, but please don't touch me. That's not easy.
Exactly. Well, I really appreciate you, Dr. Sapire, Dennis, my friend of decades. And if you ever have a desire to come on my show without me reaching out about some hot topic, you are always welcome. And I want to thank you especially for being basically on what is the pilot of this new series of conversations that I'm doing. And for my audience, I didn't reach out directly to Dr. Sapire. I Googled the sort of expert that I wanted to find, and one of the first people that came up was Dr. Sapire, who is my friend Dennis of decades. So I'm so glad that you've spent the 45 minutes with me.
Well, thank you, Nicholas. I hope I've been helpful.
You've been very helpful, and please come back again. And I'm going to put your website back on the screen one more time because I like to do that for my guests. But it is actually very easy to remember because your initials are dsphd.com. What final question? You're very successful. You have obviously put yourself in a position where you could retire if you wanted to, but in a recent email, you mentioned you work 60 hours a week. Why? That's the question. Why?
It doesn't feel like work. 90% of what I do is an absolute delight.
Well, I love hearing that, and it's been an absolute delight having you on the show. And to
Thank you
everyone
for
at
having me.
home, you're
I'm
welcome.
sorry, I missed that.
I was just about to say to everyone at home, thank you
Uh-huh.
for watching. And
Ah,
thanks again, Dennis.
you're most welcome.
You can hang out here in the green room and talk to me after the show if you
Okay,
want.
will
Thanks again
do.
for watching, everybody. Bye bye.
In a safe place, I got room to breathe. Been a long chase, but at last I'm free. These open woods, I knew I could find peace here. Nothing like the city where I got tired of the running, the catching up. I got hungry for the stunning high mountain tops. So I made some plans, some dreams. Get the rushing, heaven only